All right, welcome everybody to the Summer Vegetable Garden. I am Dean Gunderson, Chief Programs Officer at Seed St. Louis. If you don't know who Seed St. Louis is, we're a nonprofit that operates here in the St. Louis metro area. We support about 250 different community groups that are growing food in various different ways that if you have questions about, I'm happy to answer at the end. But one of those ways we do is by providing free education on growing food. And so tonight is one of those classes. Welcome. Yeah. Of course, my clicker always wants to be slow at the beginning. There we go. So tonight, just as like a quick kind of outline, we're first going to talk about timing your warm season plants. We're then going to go into those summer cover crops that you can do and that we recommend. We're then going to talk a little bit about actually extending your cool season. So the stuff that you probably already have in your garden, how to get those to harvest as we start warming up. And then we will get into the best summer practices. So just like some general summer gardening stuff to know. And then we will go into like individual profiles of warm season crops. So kind of the main warm season crops that people like to grow in St. Louis. We will go into just stuff to know about them, some varieties we recommend, pests and diseases to look out for, and how to address those for each of those crops as we wind up today. So for timing, it's important to know a couple things. So hardiness zone. So the hardiness zone is something that changes every once in a while. But what's important to know about the hardiness zone is that it is a measure of the lowest temperature an area is expected to get in the winter. So this does not directly tell you about summer gardening. But the reason I bring it up here is that it does generally impact when your last frost date is. Generally, the colder your hardiness zone, the later in spring your last frost date is. And also that we just had an update a couple years ago to our hardiness zones. We are getting warmer. Like that's really hard to deny at this point if you spend any time outside with plants. But historically, the city of St. Louis was zone 6B, which means that it gets down to -5, or at least it gets below 0, somewhere between 0 and -5. And then kind of the further afield areas of the metro were 6A, which means that they get down to at least -5, somewhere between -5 and -10 at some point in the winter. Not necessarily every winter, but that's a thing that can happen semi-regularly. We don't usually get that cold anymore, or at least it's been a long time since we got quite that cold. Wind chills get that cold, but the actual measured temperature does not get as cold. And so in 2023, they did update the hardiness zone, but it's not 100% accurate either. So it now says that the city and areas south of St. Louis City are zone 7A, which means that it doesn't get below 0, which is not true. It got below 0 last winter. And that areas outside are zone 6B. That's actually probably pretty accurate for kind of the whole metro, which means that we're still getting below 0, but not very often, and we're not getting down to -5. The important things to know for the summer garden, though, is those frost dates, which again are impacted by hardiness zones. But I bring up that change because I've had a lot of gardeners ask me oh, we're updated to zone 7, so I can now grow all these different things. And you can't. It hasn't actually changed what we can do all that much. And particularly, it has not actually impacted the last frost date at all. So, as you might have noticed, although it's been a lot warmer, we've already hit 90 degrees multiple times. And yet it also was down to 12 3 weeks ago. And so we are getting warmer. The temperatures are getting a lot hotter earlier, but we're still getting frosts late. And so you still can't plant your tomatoes any earlier. Unfortunately, you still can't do those things earlier. Our last frost date is still April 15th. That is not to say that we will never get a frost after April 15th. Again, it's a statistical kind of average. By the time you hit April 15th, there's only a 10% chance that we will have another frost. So again, it will happen. There's a 1 out of 10 chance that it will happen. But by the middle of April, we're usually past the most cold. We're kind of moving, we're generally moving towards warmth. And then the first frost is October 20th. So again, kind of that second half of October is usually when you can expect there to be a frost by that point. And that's important because warm season crops cannot handle frost. So basically that's our window for the warm season garden. The summer garden is between kind of mid-April to kind of mid-October. Like that's their area. So the cool season crops that you have already planted, you're really planting in March and then again in July and August, which may sound ridiculous. That's a fall gardening class to discuss, but you have to plant them when it's hot so that they're ready when it's cool. And the warm season stuff that we'll be talking about tonight is really you're planting it in like April, May. Some of them you can plant even later, like into June, a few of them. But for the most part, it's really like late April through late May is kind of when we'll be planting most of these crops. And each one's a little different, which we will talk about. Now my clicker, come on. There we go. The best way to know when to plant each individual crop is to just look at our planting calendar. Somebody in the past of our organization made this calendar, and we now update it every year just to make sure and like catch things that we notice that are off, or to make slight changes. There are some like slight tweaks that we have made to move stuff earlier or later in the fall to fit with kind of a longer hot season. But the summer stuff has not actually moved that much. And you can just look on this calendar. This is also up. This is up on our website, on our homepage at seedstl.org. You can scroll down and pull it up on your phone, pull it up on your computer, print it off if you want. Do whatever you want with it. But you'd see like with basil here, you just go across and you can see you can transplant a seedling or plant seed, which we'll talk about, starting in kind of the beginning of May. So like that's really when you're looking to plant it. But you can actually plant it anytime in those kind of slash marks. So anytime between the beginning of May to the middle of June is a safe time to plant basil. And you can go through and you can see kind of all of the different summer crops that you might want. And you'll notice here this line, this is our last frost date. And you'll see there's this whole group of things that are all being planted in this window of kind of early to mid-May through June. And again, those are our summer crops. But before we get to the summer crops that you will eat, we'll talk about cover crops first to get those out of the way. So cover crops are like definitionally what they are is a plant that is grown for the protection and enrichment of the soil. So these are not things you're growing to eat. They're things that you're growing to preserve your soil in some way or to improve your soil in some way. Cover crops are, and then, quote, killed on the surface or incorporated into the soil before they mature. So again, these are things that you are killing. You're not letting, grow, turn brown. That's not generally a cover crop, although you could kind of debate that, I guess. But technically, you're doing this when they are green, and it's almost always before they go to seed. That's the main reason that you would be doing it, because if you let it go to seed and then drop those seeds, it can then be a weed, depending on what type of cover crop. Some of them can be kind of weedy if you let them go to seed. So generally, you're killing them before they start setting seed, which is when they are still green. And then you can either like lay them down as mulch or, till them into the soil or whatever you're going to do. The benefits of cover crops, or why you might be interested in them, is cover crops can suppress weeds. So if a cover crop is growing, it means there's not space for weeds to be growing. They add organic matter. So it's a way to enrich your soil. They can actually enhance mycorrhizal numbers, which is like beneficial fungi. They can actually improve all sorts of different beneficial organisms in the soil. They can add nitrogen if you have a nitrogen fixing cover crop, like a bean or a pea or something like that. They actually mobilize nutrients. So nutrients are not just nutrients can be complicated. Soil all has nutrients in it. It's just not always available to plants. But cover crops can work to kind of make the nutrients in the soil more available. And then as they are decomposing, because you killed them, that it can then make those nutrients available to the next plants that you plant, kind of like increasing the nutrients without actually adding nutrients. It can also reduce nutrient loss by helping to absorb any nutrients that might otherwise wash away or leach out of your soil. They can attract beneficial insects, and they also increase water infiltration. So just by the nature of them kind of breaking up the soil, improving mycorrhizal fungi and other beneficial organisms in the soil, they can increase how quickly and how deeply water can go into your soil, which is good, because otherwise, if the water from rain can't absorb quickly enough, it's just going to wash off and you're going to lose it. They can create mulch because it is like dead plant material once you kill it, which is then mulch. That's the definition of mulch. And reduce erosion. So why plant them in the warm season? A lot of times when people are thinking of cover crops, they're thinking of planting something in the winter. And that is absolutely a great time to plant cover crops, but you might also plant them in the warm season. So if you're not going to use your garden in the warm season, and that may sound kind of ridiculous if you're here to learn about summer vegetables, but if you're at like a school garden, a lot of our school gardens that we work with, there's not people there, consistently all summer long. And so maybe it doesn't make sense to plant tomatoes, but you also don't want a bunch of weeds and you want to improve your soil over the summer. And so then you might plant a cover crop at that time. It could also just be because you have a break in your gardening plan. So if I'm growing cabbage, you're not really harvesting cabbage until kind of mid-June. And then if I want to grow, carrots in that garden for the fall, I'm planting carrots again, like late July, early August. That's not very long. Like that's not enough time to grow beans or tomatoes or peppers or something, but it is enough time to grow a cover crop. It can also be just because you're having like soil-borne diseases or pests. Having kind of a break, having a different plant growing in that soil can help kind of break that disease cycle. And so it's just a way to you can just throw it in there. If you've got soil that you don't really know what to do with in the summer, even if it's a pretty short window, you can fit a cover crop in. And the two that we really like for this purpose are buckwheat, because it's incredibly fast. Like it is ready. It's like it's going to flower and it's ready to be kind of cut and incorporated into the soil within like 30 to 60 days at most. So like that is perfect for that window of the example that I gave between like cabbage and carrots. Like it'll grow, and then you get buckwheat, which is going to cover the soil. It'll suppress some of those summer grass weeds. It flowers really well, so it also attracts a lot of pollinators and beneficial insects. And it's also really easy to kill, which is a helpful thing for summer cover crops, because a lot of other summer cover crops are grasses, and they're not very easy to kill. The other one is cowpeas. So cowpeas are really great for a lot of the same reasons. They're just a little bit longer. So they're 60 to 90 days. So this is the one that we recommend for like school gardens. Like if you're going to be closed for, like a couple months in the summer, cowpeas are really great. They shade the ground really well. They're really good at suppressing weeds. And they're also nitrogen fixing. So they'll add some nitrogen into your soil. And they're also very easy to kill, which we will get to. So when to plant them is just whenever you need to fill some space, as long as there isn't frost, you can plant, buckwheat or cowpeas. To plant them, you're going to do a lot of the same thing you would do to plant anything else. It's good to weed your bed. Like you don't want to plant this into a big weedy patch, because otherwise those weeds are probably going to win. So you want to kind of weed what's there already. If you need to add any amendments to your soil, this is a great time to do it. And then work up your soil. You don't need to, necessarily till it or do a whole lot of working up of the soil, but you don't want to just like throw it on top of like rock hard dirt if your dirt isn't kind of aerated in some way. And you can do that even just like with a hoe, like as you're weeding. If you're, weeding and the soil is, fluffy just for the top couple inches, that's enough for these, buckwheat and cowpeas. And then a lot of times I just broadcast it. You can just literally kind of like scatter it around the soil and then use just your hand, like rubbing across the soil surface, or a hard rake or even a leaf rake to just kind of rake the seeds into the soil. Or you can plant it in rows. You can also sometimes just throw it on the soil surface, rake it in a little bit, and throw some mulch on top. And cowpeas and buckwheat will also grow up through that. They're pretty big seeds. They've got a lot of energy, and they can grow up through mulch as well. Killing cover crops, you want to, timing, like we already talked about. You don't want to, you want to cut them down before they set seeds. So, if the buckwheat is done flowering, you want to make sure that it is cut. Like you don't want to let it sit there and mature a bunch of seeds. So once flowering has started, that's your cue that like you should cut it down. You can cut them down earlier than that if you want. And with buckwheat and cowpeas both, if you cut them, they die. Like you don't have to do anything else with it. You can also like pull them out of the ground if you want to, but the roots break down pretty quickly on those two, so you don't generally need to do that. So that's cover crops. So some things for the summer garden in general, things to think about for Midwest summers. Summer gardening is all about correctly managing heat, water, and pests, because those are all the big things of summer. The humidity and long stretches of heat that we get can really exacerbate pest and disease issues, which is why we're going to talk about those. And so one of the things to make sure you're doing is not overcrowding things. A lot of these summer crops, you get them and you get this little tiny tomato plant and it says space 2 feet apart. And you look at it and you're like, this doesn't need 2 feet. You're like, oh, I'll do it just a little closer. But that plant will get really big. Like a lot of these things, they grow a lot. And so you want to make sure that you're not crowding them, because that smashing them together is going to keep them wet longer. It's going to increase the humidity in there. Those are all things that are going to increase diseases, especially, but can also actually increase insect pests as well. And then using mulch to cover the soil. And mulch is any dead plant material. I particularly like straw or leaves that fall from your trees in autumn are really good. You can use wood chips. I really don't like wood chips in vegetable gardens just because I think they're harder to clear off the soil whenever I need to plant seeds again. But you can do that. I know some people who have. But that really helps with soil moisture management and temperature as well. So a couple quick notes on cool season vegetables as we get into the summer garden. These are all things that, you planted before the last frost. These are all things that for the most part are being planted in March before, when we're still having frosts. And then you can plant them again in summer to be harvested in fall. They will get bitter and or bolt, which is the name for when they start going to seed. They'll start getting longer and send up little buds and then flowers and then eventually set seed. When they start doing that, they're not going to grow any more food for you. And a lot of them will start getting kind of bitter. They'll get more tough. And so if something starts to bolt, it's time to just call it, cut it, harvest it, do whatever you're going to do with it. The exceptions to the rule, though, of that is chard, collards, and kale. So these 3 cool season crops, they like the cool season. That's really when they thrive, but they will also survive our summer without going bad and will then continue to grow again more happily in the fall. And so they are unique in that feature. And so they are a part of the summer garden, but you will have generally already planted them, although you could plant them now still because they will grow throughout the summer. For those cool season crops, particularly those things like chard, collards, and kale that you might want to survive through the summer, but really any of them as we start moving into warmer temperatures, doing things like shading them can actually be really helpful to make them more happy as we go into hotter times. And there is shade cloth. That's what this picture is here. It's just kind of like a black netting material. It's the same as those kind of like shade sails that you might see at parks. But you can get it in rolls or squares, like all different shapes. And just like suspending that or draping that over a plant. These cool season crops actually are adapted to the lower light that we get in the cooler seasons of spring and fall. And so as we move into, late April, May, June, the light is much more intense than they need. And so shading them is not going to limit their growth at all. And so providing that shade as we move into, especially May, June, will help them tolerate the heat more, and they will produce better for you. The warm season vegetables are things that grow in summer through the fall. So young summer plants won't grow well and can die even in cool weather. All of them will die if there's a frost, but even just not frozen, but, upper 30s, 40s can severely damage or stunt some of these crops, which is why a lot of them we're not really planting until the beginning of May. Some will slow their production as we move into fall when it's cooler, although they won't die until it freezes. But some actually do not slow down and are happier. So like bell peppers, I find are happier as we move into the cooler temperatures of fall. But again, they can't tolerate frost. So these are all planted after the last frost date, which, as we talked about, is April 15th. And they have zero frost tolerance. And this is what kind of defines them as warm season crops. For your warm season crops, for any crops, but for the warm season ones I have listed here, I always like to talk about direct seed versus transplant. So direct seed is just the idea of taking a seed and sticking it directly in the ground where you want it to grow, versus a transplant are these little potted plants that you either grow yourself inside or you buy from someone who has done that, and then you stick that in the garden. So you can do a transplant of just about anything, but that doesn't mean that it's worth it to do that or needed to do that. And so I just want to assure you that if you're, especially if your goal is to save money, direct seeding is always cheaper. And for things like okra, squash, and by squash that includes pumpkins, butternut squash, acorn squash, zucchinis, patty pans, everything in that group, cucumbers, sunflowers, beans, cowpeas, all of those do just fine, and generally I think do better if they're just direct seeded into the ground, versus things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, basil, and sweet potatoes. You really get a significant benefit of doing a seedling. And for things like sweet potatoes, if you stick just like a sweet potato in the ground that hasn't sprouted or anything yet, you're just not going to get sweet potatoes. Our season isn't long enough to do that. You really need a little kind of plant for that. So for things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, basil, sweet potatoes, those are absolutely worth it to do transplants. But for these other things that are listed over here, just plant the seed directly. If you really want to do transplants, that's of course fine, but you don't have to for those. When you're buying seeds and transplants, just a couple things to keep in mind. It's really helpful to know what varieties you're working with, and that is helpful. Even if you're not, if you're to the point where you're just like, I'm brand new, I don't have any idea what I'm looking at, I'm just going to go to the nursery and buy whatever cabbage they have. That's of course fine. I still do that with some things. That's how I started. There is nothing wrong with that. But it is helpful when you plant that cabbage to make a note somewhere of what type of cabbage it was. Because if you grow it and it was terrible, you don't want to buy it again next year, because that variety is probably not good for you. Or if you grew it and it was amazing, you want to know what that variety was so that you make sure you can get it again next year. So it's really helpful to at least keep notes, even if you're not seeking out a specific variety, because if you find one that you really like, well, then you probably will be seeking out that variety. And it's helpful to know what variety you're looking for. If you are looking through, various options though, especially if you're looking through seed catalogs or you're looking online, it's helpful and important to pick locally adapted varieties. And what I mean by that is, there's different varieties that do well in different parts of the US, and different parts of the world more broadly. But you want something that's going to do well here, obviously. But there's seed companies all over the country, and they will all send you seed catalogs. You're not just getting seed catalogs from places that are the same climate as you. And so it's important as you're reading descriptions to also know where these seed companies are. So if you grew, tomatoes last year, let's say, and you had issues with the heat, it got really hot, they didn't produce. And so you're like, oh, I need a tomato that would do better in the heat. And you're reading through a catalog, and you have that in your mind. And so then you're looking and you see a description that says, did great in the heat, the horrible heat of 2022. It was the only one that produced for us, and it's amazing and delicious and great. Well, you're gonna read that and you're like, wow, that's exactly what I want. And then you buy it and then you plant it and it doesn't do well. Well, if that seed company was from Maine, which there's a lot of great seed companies in Maine, that description is completely worthless to you, because hot in Maine is not hot in St. Louis. Those are completely different things. And so you want to know who is writing that. And if you're looking for something that is more adapted to our heat, then you want to be looking at seed companies that are from, Virginia, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, somewhere that is hotter than us, or at least as hot as us. You don't want to be looking places that are much further north, which is where a lot of the seed companies are, is north of us. So it's just helpful to know kind of where that's coming from. And then if you're out at a nursery or a plant sale and you're looking at buying a transplant, you want to look for a healthy one. So one that's not, turned yellow and all its leaves are dead or something. But also one that's about the right size, which is easier said than done. But what I mean by that is if you've got, if there's this like giant pot and it's this little tiny seedling in there, you probably don't want to buy that. For one, because you're getting overcharged, but also because as you pull that out, all the soil's going to kind of fall off. The roots are going to get damaged, and it's just not going to be worth it. But you also don't want one if the pot's this big and then the plant is huge, because then the roots are going to be super stunted and it's going to be a lot harder for it to get established in your soil. So a lot of times what you're looking for is, something like a ratio of about like this. So you can see, the plant is obviously bigger than the roots, but it's not crazy. It's not this like huge plant up here, and it's not a little tiny plant in this. And as you see the roots here, you can see the roots, like the roots are around the outside, which is why when you pull it out, all the soil holds together. But it's also not solid roots. You don't want something that's completely root bound to do that. And those are about the things you're looking for. There we go. If you are growing your own seedlings, hardening off is a process that is incredibly important. This is critical to help your seedlings adjust to life outside. So if your seedlings have been growing inside, especially like in your house for, however long you've been growing them, they've had a pretty cushy life. It's why we spend trillions of dollars and are literally destroying the world around us so that we can all live inside more, because it's really nice in here. It's really great inside. But to then take a plant who has lived its whole life doing that and then just throw it outside, and it's like, you live out here 24 hours a day now. That shock is extreme. And a lot of them, because they're babies as well, they're just going to die, is what happens to a lot of these plants if you just throw them outside after being inside all the time. And so we do this process called hardening off, which is just a slow introduction to the real world. It generally takes about a week. And usually what I do, because I work Monday through Friday, I can't be home every day of the week. And so I usually start on a Saturday, and it's where you're just slowly increasing the amount of time that they're outside. So I start on a Saturday where I put them outside in the sun for, maybe, 3 hours, maybe 4 hours, depends on how hot it is. And then I bring them back inside. And then Sunday, I'll put them out for, maybe 4, 5, 6 hours, something like that. And then I bring them back inside. And then Monday, they got to be outside for like 10 hours, because I work for 8 hours. I commute. I got to drop my kids off, all that stuff. And so they can't be in the sun that long, though. That's a big jump. And so I put them outside, but somewhere in the shade for, that like 10 hours. And then on Tuesday, I'm like putting them somewhere where they're in the sun for a little bit, but then like the way that the sun moves, a tree then shades them for the rest of the day. And then I like move it so it's just a little bit more sun, so that by Friday, they're out in the sun, all the time. And then I leave them out there. And then generally by Saturday, I'm transplanting them, and they do good. And that's all it is. It doesn't need to be complicated. You'll see things where everyone's like, no, it has to be 2 hours, and then 4 hours, and then 6 hours, and then 8 hours, and then 12 hours. I'm just like, I don't know who can do that. I don't know who can do that. I can't do that. And you don't have to, in my experience, but the gradual increase, of the stress is important, but you can do that stress with shade as well as just time. So then when you have your transplants, if you're not direct seeding, you're going to dig a hole that's a little bit deeper than the plant. If you're planting tomatoes, peppers, or eggplants, it can be helpful to put a little scoop of fertilizer, and you can use whatever, granular fertilizer you want, into the hole. For tomatoes and peppers, I also put a little bit of crushed eggshells. You can also use just like a calcium fertilizer, but eggshells are free. And that will prevent blossom end rot, which is where the bottom of the fruit kind of gets black, brown, squishy, starts rotting kind of from the bottom. That's a calcium deficiency that causes that. And then you'll put just a little bit of soil over that, so the fertilizer isn't in like direct contact with the roots. And then you stick the plant back in. And yeah, you want to make sure that it's in there at the same level that it was in the pot, that it's at the same level in the soil. The only exception to that is tomatoes, which you can plant kind of all the way up to just the top couple leaves, because you can bury the stem of tomatoes. You don't want to do that with any other plant, though. And then you kind of press lightly around the plant, like not like shoving it into the ground. You're not packing it, but just kind of like firm it in a little bit. And then you want to water the plant as soon as possible until you see water pooling around the base of the plant, and then let it soak in. Now, the individual crops. So we'll go through now kind of some of the most common warm season crops. I'm not going to talk about every single one, although I'm happy to answer those questions at the end if I missed any that you're particularly interested in. But the first one is beans. So pole beans and bush beans, they're both the same plant, but they just have different growing structures. So these are actually the one summer thing that you can start planting kind of right after our last frost. And the main reason for that is they grow so fast and they grow so easily that even if we have a late frost and they die, you can just plant them again and you'll still be fine getting a crop. These are, again, best to plant directly from seed. You don't need to do a transplant for beans. If you're growing pole beans, these are the ones that will need something to climb. These are the ones that will produce big, long vines. These are the ones that I recommend if you're growing, especially like in a small space, or you're not planning on preserving your harvest. If you're just planning on, harvesting fresh and eating fresh, pole beans are really nice because you get a smaller amount, but over a long period. And so they are nice for that, but they do need some sort of trellis or a pole or something to climb up. Bush beans, on the other hand, again, same species, same type of plant. They're just selections that have been bred to have really short vines. And so they grow as like a little bush looking thing. And that's what this picture is down here. So they can support themselves. So they do not need a trellis. So these are good if you just really don't want a trellis for some reason. But they produce, for the most part, a whole bunch kind of all at once, or at least over a relatively short period. So this is really helpful if you do want to preserve, because it's a lot easier to get a whole bunch of beans all at once that you can freeze or can or whatever than having a little bit every week that you have to freeze a little bit every week. So they are good for that. But if you are wanting to just eat fresh from the garden, the pole beans usually work a little better for that. The one thing I will say, the main pests for beans is rabbits. Rabbits love beans, especially when they're young. They will just mow them down. They will just come and just eat the whole plant. They love them. And so if you have ever had rabbit issues, or especially if you are seeing rabbits running around your yard or your garden, you are going to want some kind of fencing around your beans, at least until they get established. Once they're kind of full grown, then the leaves kind of get tougher. The rabbits will still eat them if you have a lot of rabbits, but they don't like them as much. But if the little baby plants, they will completely destroy them. And so just a fence of some kind. You need a fence that is like a chicken wire size or smaller. If it's any bigger than chicken wire size, they can squeeze through it. I don't know how. I've watched it with my own eyes and I still don't understand how it happened, but they can squeeze through things. I had fencing that was even the same size as chicken wire, but instead of being kind of those like hexagon or octagon kind of shapes, they were square, and they still even squeeze through that. So it's really like chicken wire or smaller if you really want to make sure rabbits don't get in there. For the most part, kind of all green beans do well in St. Louis, or at least I haven't run across one that does bad. But some of the ones that we like in particular, for pole beans, we like Vortex. And for bush beans, we like Cascadia. And then I really like cowpeas. They are super easy to grow, but they're a little harder to grow if you want like green beans per se. You can absolutely eat them as green beans, but they get tough pretty quickly. They're mostly grown for shelling beans. So like a lima bean, or, like you would eat like individual peas, where you're like breaking open the pod and then scooping out the immature seeds and eating those as that. They're very good for that. Very easy to grow. But it just depends on kind of what did you like to eat. But you grow them the same way, which is why I added them on here. Cucumbers. So cucumbers are, fun fact, the number 3 crop in American vegetable gardens. It's the 3rd most popular one. But they're kind of a pain, just because there's a lot of diseases that they can get. For cucumbers, you're generally going to start planting in early May. You can do seeds or seedlings, although again, I generally like seeds for cucumbers. You can do seedlings. It's just I like seeds. A lot of people will actually do a second planting of cucumbers in late June or early July, and that is because cucumbers almost always will get mildew and die. And so if you have a second planting, then by the time the first round dies, the second one is starting to produce. And so that's the thing. If you've consistently had mildew issues, you might consider doing the second planting. It's highly recommended that you grow these on trellises because of the mildew. If you let them grow just kind of sprawling on the ground, they're going to get those mildew diseases much more quickly because there's less airflow. Getting them up on trellises increases airflow, increases sun exposure, and slows down that mildew. If you are consistently having mildew, one of the things that I would recommend that is going to sound kind of crazy is doing preventative sprays to help prevent the mildew from getting established of whey or milk. So animal-based dairy actually has some fungicidal properties that are really effective, and they act as kind of a mild foliar fertilizer as well to get plants nutrients they need anyways. For that, I usually like to use powdered milk or powdered whey just because it's easier to just make sure I have around my garden. And you would do a minimum of 2 tablespoons of powdered milk or whey per gallon of water. Mix it up until it's dissolved, and then you just completely spray the whole plant, tops, bottoms of the leaves, everything. And you want to do that when it's like real sunny, because it's actually the ultraviolet radiation from the sun interacting with the dairy that creates the reaction that is toxic to fungal spores. This is used commercially in organic vineyards in some parts of the world. And so it's surprisingly effective, but it's pretty much only effective as a preventative. So this is something like if your plants already look like this is not going to make these leaves better. But if you spray it on these healthy ones, it will help prevent them from getting infected as well. If you have infected leaves like this, you want to remove those, like cut those off and remove them, because otherwise they're going to help encourage and increase the spread to the healthy parts of the plant. So when you're looking for varieties of cucumbers, because of just how unbelievably common it is to have mildew issues in St. Louis on cucumbers, you want to look for varieties that specifically say they are mildew resistant. There's a lot of varieties now that have been bred for mildew resistance, because mildew is really common throughout the U.S., especially in the South. And so again, a lot of those more southern growers have that. Just some of the ones that we've had good luck with, although again, there's quite a few good cucumbers, are Market More 76, which is good just as a like classic cucumber, good for like salads, slicing up, using as a cucumber. Little Leaf is one that is really good as a pickling cucumber. And then a particularly strange one is called Armenian cucumber. The reason I say this one is strange is that it is actually a cantaloupe. But it looks and tastes like a cucumber. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I promise it's not just me saying this. This is a thing. The benefit of it, though, because it does look a little different. Like it's got kind of ridges. It's more of like a pale green to it, but it does taste just like a cucumber. You can slice it like a cucumber. You can pickle it like a cucumber. And the benefit of it is that because it is not a cucumber, because it is a melon, it does not get cucumber beetles anywhere near as much, which is the main insect pest that you'll see on cucumbers. Although I have not had a lot of issues with cucumber beetles, so can't give a lot of real solid recommendations on that. The other thing is that they're also far less prone to mildew. Again, I've rarely had mildew issues on it. And if you're one of those unfortunate people that cucumbers make you burp, the chemical that is in cucumbers that makes you burp still exists even in burpless cucumbers. So if you're really sensitive to it, even burpless cucumbers will make you burp. But Armenian cucumbers, because it's actually a melon and not a cucumber, has none of that chemical. So people that are really sensitive to that compound in cucumbers can eat Armenian cucumbers without any issues. So you can eat cucumbers again if you want. So this is like a group of plants, because these are not super common, but I like to highlight them. And these are southern greens. So like I mentioned, you can grow chard, collards, and kale over the summer, but they don't like the summer. So a couple years ago, we did some trials of tropical greens to see if they would grow successfully as like a summer annual and produce a reasonable amount of food and like not be gross. And to see how they did, we grew, I think it was close to like 10 or 12 different types of greens. And the ones that came out on top were Malabar spinach, which is a vine. This is the picture of it here. It's really pretty. It's actually sold as an annual ornamental. Now, I've seen it at quite a few nurseries the last couple of years, like in the flower section, but it is food. The leaves are edible. The one thing I'll say about it, though, is that it is mucilaginous, which is to say it is slimy. So it's similar to like okra in its like kind of slimy texture, which if you like okra, you will probably like Malabar spinach. But if you do not like that, you are not going to like Malabar spinach. Do not grow it. But it's very productive, very prolific, incredibly resistant to our heat, no pests, no diseases. It's a good one to grow if you like that kind of okra mucilage. Another one is called Lagos spinach, which is actually also known as celosia. If you've ever grown like the ornamental flower celosia, it's also called coxcomb sometimes because it's got kind of that weird wavy, really colorful flower top to it that looks kind of like the red part on a rooster. The Lagos spinach, though, which is the food form of that plant, is huge. It's not the little tiny ornamental celosia that is often planted. It'll get 8 feet tall, 6-7 feet wide. It's like a big bush that grows just in the couple months of summer. Very productive. The leaves are beautiful. The flowers are beautiful. The flavor is a little strong. It's not generally one that you're going to eat as like a lettuce or anything like that, but as a cooked green, it's quite good. And butterflies really like the flowers of it as well, I've noticed. Another one is Molokia. This is a crop that's originally from kind of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's primarily grown in Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, kind of all those areas around there. And it's very fast growing. It was shocking. So it actually got a huge amount of damage from Japanese beetles. And so we had kind of written it off, but didn't pull it out. But then when the Japanese beetles went away at kind of the end of July, beginning of August, it just took off. And so from the beginning of August until, mid-October, it grew like this is the plant here, like that I'm standing next to. And that's all growth that happened in just August, September, and then, part of October. So it's incredibly fast growing. There's a lot of leaves on there, but this is another one that the leaves are a little mucilaginous, nowhere near as much as like Malabar spinach. But it is kind of a unique texture. So it's one that, I wouldn't just grow a whole bunch and assume you're going to love it. But growing some, really easy to grow, other than the Japanese beetles, which again, even though the Japanese beetles completely shredded it, it didn't kill them. I just kind of forgot them, and they were fine. As soon as the Japanese beetles went away, they just took off again. And so very easy to grow, but they are kind of more of almost like a late summer or fall green. And then the last one is one that we mostly consider a weed here, which is purslane. So you can buy seeds and plant purslane. I'm not necessarily recommending you do that, although it doesn't hurt to do that. But a lot of people have this growing as a weed already, and I just like to remind you that it is edible. It's actually delicious if you've never had it. It's good fresh. It's good cooked. It's highly nutritious, and it's basically indestructible. It can actually switch between multiple types of photosynthesis. It's incredibly heat tolerant, incredibly drought tolerant. It's a great one to utilize if it's growing anyways. So these are all ones that you would start from seed in mid-May. But they don't really get going until we get consistent warm weather, whenever that happens, which again is usually in May, June, sometimes in there. So the next one is melons. So for melons, you would start from seeds or plant seedlings. And you would do that in early to mid-May. So this is one that, again, I like direct seeding, but if you've had issues specifically with getting them to germinate, growing them as seedlings first can help. You're only growing them as a seedling for like maybe 2 weeks. Like you don't need to grow them long as a seedling, but melons can be a little particular about their soil. And so if you're having issues getting them to germinate in like a seed starting mix can be helpful, and then transplanting it out. And that seems to help them adapt a little bit better. They need all of them. This is like watermelon, cantaloupe, honeydew, all of them. They need a lot of water. They need a lot of space, and they need pretty good draining soil. Like, you don't want to plant these in like a real heavy clay or something like that. So they do really well in raised beds. If you don't have raised beds, if you are gardening in ground, that's where like mounds come in, like where people like, you like shovel the dirt together into like a little mound of soil, and then you plant in the mound. And they really appreciate that drainage. It's also possible to trellis smaller melons. Like, you're not going to trellis, a giant watermelon or something, but you can trellis some like good size, watermelons on a trellis, as long as the trellis is strong enough. So you need to have like a pretty strong like fencing material, and the posts need to be in the ground deep enough to hold whatever weight you're wanting to put on that trellis. But they can, of course, also grow on the ground. To tell when a melon is ripe, you want to look at the last tendril that is close to the fruit. So like this picture here, here's the melon forming, and then like this tendril is the closest one. So if like once that is dry and can like break off whenever it like snaps off, then the plant is done sending water and sugar to the fruit, and the fruit is as ripe as it's going to get. It's time to harvest. It's good to mulch with compost or leaf mulch, which is just kind of like a decomposed, chopped up leaves around the plants after a few months, particularly, after a few months, once they get growing. For watermelons, the varieties that we really like are Sugar Baby and Triple Crown, although again, there's probably other watermelons that also do quite well here. Okra. You want to start okra from seed in mid-May. They want it hot. Like, do not plant okra early. Virtually no pests to speak of in St. Louis. They do very well in Missouri summers. The main issue that most people have with okra is that it produces too much. What a terrible problem to have. A food that's too easy to grow. But it can be annoying because they grow so quickly that if you are not out there regularly, the pods can get too big and woody, and then you have to just like cut it and kind of get rid of it because they're not really edible at that point. So the general rule that I'll just say, because it's the general rule, is you want to harvest them when they're no larger than like 4 inches. After that, people say they get woody. The size is not actually what determines how woody the pod is, though. But if it is small, it is not going to be woody. And so a lot of people use that as a visual cue. But especially if you only have a couple okra plants that you're growing, if you just kind of squeeze the pod, like, you'll feel it. Like, if it's woody, it's woody. If you squeeze it and it starts like popping, you'll feel like you can feel it if it's still tender. And then I've had ones that were pretty big and still tender. It actually has more to do with the amount of time. It's like a certain number of days being on the plant is when it starts going woody. And so if it's growing really fast at the time, they can be a lot bigger and still be tender, versus if they're growing slower at the time, they'll be a lot smaller and before they start getting woody. And so you can check individual ones, but if you're harvesting them at like 4 inches or smaller, you can basically be guaranteed that they're all going to be tender. Again, pretty much all like, I haven't grown an okra that didn't do well for me. They're, again, just really great plants. Clemson spineless is by far the most commonly planted one. And that is because okra does have they have these like itchy like hairs on the leaves and the pods. Clemson spineless has fewer of those, although it still has them. And so as you're picking okra, it's really nice to have long sleeves, even though it's hot. The long sleeves are worth it. And it's also valuable to know that the leaves are also edible. Again, you're not going to want to eat the big, giant ones that have the itchy hairs on them, but like younger leaves, when they're still pretty tender, are actually surprisingly good. Sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes, you can start planting in May, and you really want to get them in the ground kind of as soon as possible. Like, if it's June and you haven't planted your sweet potatoes, just don't. Like, it's just not worth it at that point. You really need to get those in May. You're going to plant them from a slip, it's called, which is like these little shoots that come out, and then you just break it off and you can stick it in the ground. And you can see that's what we're doing here. We're literally just sticking it in the ground. Beauregard is a very reliable variety. It's the most common one that you're going to find plant like slips for sale in the St. Louis area because it's just kind of the tried and true one that does really well here. Puerto Rico is another one that does pretty well and has short vines. So it's good if you don't want your sweet potatoes to take over your whole bed, which they will. The vines go pretty long, but Puerto Rico has shorter vines, so it's a little bit more compact. It's also good if you want to grow in containers. Puerto Rico is a good one. You then harvest whenever you want, really, but you need to do it before the first frost in the fall. You can start harvesting as soon as you start seeing the roots push up through the soil, which can be any time in like September, October. But there's not really any harm in waiting until you get close to frost. I've heard people that say that, oh no, you like if you let them get too big, they get woody, and I'm sure that's possible, but I've never had it happen. And I have literally had sweet potatoes this big that I have eaten, and they were not woody at all. They were still fine. And so I generally let them go until, kind of frost is imminent, and then you want to dig them out because they will not tolerate that frost. When you first plant them, you want to water them really well and then keep the area weeded and protected from rabbits. So this is another one that rabbits really like because the leaves are edible to people. They're really tender. They're really nutritious. And so they're also really tender and nutritious to rabbits. Once sweet potatoes get going, though, like after the first couple of weeks, they're pretty tough. It's still helpful, to weed and water them, but they don't need it as much. They're pretty. They're tough plants. They don't need as much babying as others. Zucchini and summer squash, you're going to plant seeds for this in early May. If you have space, you can do a second planting in late June or early July. Again, because there's diseases, pests, things that show up. And so having a second planting can sometimes be helpful if your first planting dies. If you have had issues with bugs in the past, you can do insect netting, which is like this really fine mesh that you put over the plant. You want to do that when they're young, and then you have to take that off when they start flowering because you need bees to pollinate them. But it will make sure that you're not getting those insects on for those first couple weeks as they're growing before they start blooming. There's an insect called vine borers that will get into the base of the stem and will just kind of like eat the inside of the stem. It will kill the whole plant. You can wrap the base of your vines in aluminum foil, which can help deter that. And then putting mulch with compost or leaf mulch around plants after a few months can be helpful to prevent fungal diseases from splashing up from the soil, especially if you're letting them grow on the ground. So some good varieties. Again, you want to look for kind of mildew-resistant varieties, particularly if you've had mildew issues in the past. Mildew is much more common on cucumbers than it is on squash, but it absolutely can also happen on squash. So things like Desert F1, Dunja F1, Success PM Straight Neck are all good zucchini summer squash varieties. Another one that I really like is Tromboncino, which is really great because it is incredibly pest resistant as well as disease resistant. And so, if you're open to trying a summer squash that doesn't look like a zucchini, it looks very different, but it tastes pretty much the same. It's incredibly pest resistant. It's a really good one to do. Winter squash, basically the same thing. You're going to plant seed in May. They will grow, though, all summer and then start ripening in September. So, the summer squash you're harvesting throughout the summer and fall. The winter squash you're harvesting in fall to then kind of eat in the winter. To know if it's ripe, use your fingernail to try and puncture the skin. And if you very easily go through, it's not ripe. The skin will kind of harden when it ripens. If you're growing smaller squash, you can trellis as long as you have a heavy duty trellis. And then Cucurbita moschata, which is a different species of squash, and a lot of good seed catalogs will now label what species of squash each variety is. The two main ones are Pepo and moschata, although there are a couple others. But the moschata are the most pest and disease resistant. So this is like butternut is the most common moschata that people know of. But again, if you want one that is like the most pest and disease resistant, that is Seminole pumpkins, and that's what this picture is here, is a Seminole pumpkin. And it's a baking pumpkin. It tastes a lot like a butternut, but it looks like a baking pumpkin. And it's a good one. If you want a classic looking butternut, honey nut and Waltham are good. And then for like a classic pumpkin, New England is a good one. Eggplants, normally you're going to transplant and not direct seed these. You're going to plant in early to mid-May. I often don't need to support them, but if they are not standing up on their own, tomato cages work really well. They need a lot of water. And if the leaves are browning at all or they're kind of like wilting, you just need to add more water. Flea beetles are the main pests of this, and that's where you'll get just like a whole bunch of little tiny holes all over the leaves. These get worse as we get drier weather. So again, keeping them watered can help with this. The main treatment for flea beetles that we like is diatomaceous earth, which is a white powder. It's just like it's a mineral that you would just kind of dust on the plant. Like I said earlier, you're going to plant these with a little bit of fertilizer. And then Asian varieties are generally more productive and easier to grow than European varieties. And the Asian varieties are these kind of like long, skinny ones. Ping Tung and Poamoho Dark Long are two that we like. Peppers are commonly transplanted in May. They need lots of sun. This is another one that, again, if you need support on them, tomato cages work really well for that. Use a fertilizer when planting, like we mentioned. For bell peppers, the fruit will change color and ripen on the plant, so you can pick whenever you want. So green peppers are just, red, yellow, or purple peppers that aren't ripe. So you can pick any of them green, or you can let them ripen to their color. For sweet peppers, the ones that we like are Corbaci, Jupiter, and Mountain Roaster. If you have leaf curl, which is where the leaves kind of like pucker and curl up, it's a sign of stress in peppers. It's likely a calcium deficiency. So that's why, again, at the beginning, we recommended adding eggshells into the hole when you plant it. But if you forgot to do that, you can also add bone meal, eggshells, or agricultural lime to the soil on the surface and then kind of water it in. Temperatures over 95 degrees cause fruit to abort. The peppers will just drop their fruit if it's over 95 degrees. And sweet peppers are the most heat sensitive. Hot peppers are less sensitive to this. So late summer, use mulch to keep the soil cool, and then shade cloth during extreme heat can help. But this is also why, like I said at the beginning, a lot of times sweet peppers actually do better as we move into the cooler weather of fall, because they can't take that real extreme heat and still produce fruit. They will still grow. They'll still get energy built up, but they won't produce fruit in those real extreme temperatures. And then lastly, the one that I assume you all came for, so hopefully you're willing to wait or to hang on here for a couple minutes to hear about tomatoes. So tomatoes are most often transplanted, but you can actually start them from seed. Usually you do both of these, in May. Like Mother's Day is the classic time. And please don't do it earlier than that. I mean, you can try, and some years it'll work, but that's the date. You really don't get a lot of benefit from planting earlier than that. If you want to try direct seeding them, direct seeded plants are very robust. They tend to be healthier, they grow faster, things like that. But you need very short season tomatoes to actually make it worth it. So you're not going to be able to grow big slicer tomatoes that way. It's going to be generally pretty small tomatoes, and you need specific varieties that are really short day to maturity. So again, tomatoes are worth it to do as transplants. There are two main types of tomatoes in terms of how they grow, and that is determinate or bush types and indeterminate. So determinate are kind of like those bush beans that we talked about. So all the fruit tends to kind of ripen at once, or they'll ripen in waves, where you get a whole bunch ripen and then you'll have several weeks where there's none and then a whole bunch ripen again. And they're usually somewhere between kind of 3 and 4 feet tall. They're not the ones that get really big. Indeterminate, on the other hand, grow and produce fruit throughout the year. So this is kind of like the pole beans that we talked about. And so these are the ones that can get huge if you let them. You are not going to prune determinate tomatoes. The determinate ones that will only get 3 to 4 feet tall and kind of come in waves, you don't need to prune those. But it can be helpful to prune those indeterminate varieties. Otherwise, they can get incredibly big, bushy, hard to see through, hard to actually get the fruit to pick. And they get more prone to disease as they get real thick and dense like that. So varieties that we really like are Black Krim, Cherokee Purple, Brad's Atomic Grape, Korean Apple. Most Roma varieties do well. Pink Love apples. And then for cherry tomatoes, we like Sun Gold and Super Sweet 100. Generally, I would say the smaller the tomato, the easier it is to grow. And I mean that in terms of fruit size. So The cherry tomatoes are generally easier to grow. They're generally more heat tolerant for some interesting geographical reasons, as opposed to the big slicers are much more sensitive to heat. They're more akin to those like bell peppers that we talked about, where when you get up into the mid 90s, they just won't set fruit. They just won't do it. And also those larger tomatoes tend to crack more often. So when we get a big storm, a lot of times that water, they'll grow really fast and they'll just crack open. And so those smaller ones are just less prone to that, although it can absolutely still happen on them. So for supporting your tomatoes, there's actually a lot of different techniques. Cages can work as long as they're strong enough to actually hold them up. A lot of the tomato cages that I see sold at the store are just not anywhere close to big enough or like thick enough wire to hold an actual tomato plant up. There's also a thing called the Florida weave, which is where you plant them in a straight row with stakes. And then as they grow, you literally kind of weave between those stakes with twine to kind of hold them up as like a two-dimensional kind of wall almost. You can have like some sort of structure that has strings dangling down and you tie them to grow up the string. Or the thing that I like that I think is the easiest is just a normal trellis, just a conventional trellis, as long as it's, again, like a nice heavy duty one. If you plant them along that as they grow up, you can just kind of weave them through the fencing material of the trellis, and it does really well. You don't want your tomatoes to be touching the ground, especially the fruit, but really having the whole plant up off the ground is helpful for avoiding disease. But the fruit you absolutely don't want touching on the ground because they will rot for the most part. So for pruning, which I alluded to, for your indeterminate tomatoes, you're going to prune suckers and any lower leaves that are touching the ground. So what I mean by a sucker is on the tomato, it's going to be, growing up, and it's the main thing, and there'll be, leaves. And at most of the leaves, there'll be a little like branch that will start coming out of that little fork. That's a sucker. And so all of those that come up, you just prune those off and you just keep like one main thing going up. And then, the lower leaves are kind of self-explanatory, but any of the leaves that are down low, you want to break those off because those are going to be prone to getting infection from fungal diseases. If squirrels eat your ripe tomatoes, you can try a couple different things. You can leave water out for them. Sometimes that helps keep them off because sometimes they're going after the tomatoes to get water, especially if it's a really dry period. You can also try like leaving out red Christmas ornaments in the off season and get them used to the idea that there's this like red thing that is not food. And sometimes that will trick them. But a lot of times, the only ways to really deal with squirrels on tomatoes is either like full enclosure, like having like a structure completely enclosing your tomatoes that they can't get through, or the easiest way to do it is harvest the tomatoes before they're fully ripe. The squirrels are not going to go after them generally until they're like fully ripe. And so if you pick them just a little bit before that and then bring them inside and let them fully ripen inside, they're still going to taste better than most tomatoes you can get at the store, but you're going to actually get to eat them. And so that's generally the best way to deal with squirrels. You want to use compost or leaf mulch below your tomato plants to add nutrients, and also helps prevent rain from splashing spores up off of the soil, which will help prevent blight and other things. And then if you see tomato hornworms, which are these big, giant green things, if you see one, just pick it off, throw it. And they're, if you give it a good toss, they're not going to make it back. Or, you might not see it right away, but if all of a sudden all the leaves start disappearing from your tomato plant, that's probably what's causing it. Look for it, find it, pick it off, and throw it. Yeah, I already talked about that. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Sorry I went over a little bit, but it's a big, big topic. But thank you. And I am now happy to answer any questions that people might have.